Margaret. Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
Okay, we're on. Good afternoon and welcome to the University of California's Latinx Research Center, an interdisciplinary and trans-Americas research hub focused on the lives, experiences, challenges, and contributions of the diverse community of communities that is the Latinx population of the United States. I am Laura Perez, chair of the Latinx Research Center and professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. I warmly welcome and thank the Latinx philosophers who join us today, Doctors Mariana Ortega, PJ DiPietro, Gabriela Veronelli, and Chel Sandoval, who will join us shortly. A warm welcome as well to all of you joining us today, including the members of the Latinx Research Center's Decolonial Knowledge's new research initiative who have organized today's panel. Our thanks as well for their solidarity to the co-sponsorship of this program, to the Center for Latin American Studies, the Chicano Studies Program, the Department of Rhetoric, Dr. Yvonne del Valle of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Social Sciences Matrix. Today's panel is dedicated to the late queer transnational feminist and decolonial philosopher Maria Lugones, who passed on July 4th, 2020, but left us with her important work. We had the pleasure of hosting Maria here at UC Berkeley for a standing room only lecture in 2007, and of working in intellectual coalition for many years on the multi-stranded project of decolonizing feminisms with her and her students at the Philosophy, Interpretation, and Culture Center at the University of Binghamton. I think she would be very pleased that two of her mentees, Drs. PJ DiPietro and her niece, Gabriela Veronelli, join us today. We've asked Dr. Veronelli, as a member of Maria Lugones' family, to please say a few words about her. As to format of today's event, we have asked each of our four speakers to present for the general public a 10-minute introduction to the core ideas of their very own rich work as philosophers concerned with racialized, gendered, and sexed injustice, and thinking beyond dominant cultural paradigms about what gets to count as knowledge. Each speaker will be introduced before their presentation, and then all four speakers will address a general question about the meaning and importance of epistemic decolonization, to be followed by 30 to 40 minutes of questions from you, the audience. The program will conclude in 2 hours, 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Again, on behalf of UC Berkeley's DK group and the LRC, a warm welcome and thanks to all of you for joining us today. And now I would like to introduce you to Dr. Cecilia Titisano, a member of the Decolonial Knowledge's Research Initiative, who in turn will tell you a little bit about the DK group. Thank you. Cecilia, por favor.
Thank you, Laura. The DK group is a decolonial knowledge group. We are an interdisciplinary research team that we have been meeting since last summer, 2020. We meet monthly for collective readings, and we're working towards an anthology project. Part of what we have been doing, it is inviting other international interdisciplinary scholars to converse with us. And we open these conversations to the public. That is what you are seeing here today. So we're very excited to share this amazing panel with all of you. And the team, would you see us here? There are a couple of us who couldn't make it today. And we have Professors Laura Perez, Patricia Baquedano Lopez, myself. We also have Abraham Ramirez, Lisette Bastidas, and Daniel Marquez. We're very excited to have you coming and meeting with us and talking, and we are ready for what is coming in the next few minutes. Let me introduce Abraham Ramirez, and he will talk a little bit about this fascinating dedication and scholarship, correct?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. Okay. So I would like to announce that the Latinx Research Center has established the Maria Lugones Undergraduate Research Fellowship in Philosophy and Critical Thought to commence next academic year, and funded for the next 5 years. The fellowship is going to be directed by faculty. The Undergraduate Research Fellowship will focus on the study of and research on US Latinx philosophy and critical thought. The fellowship will ensure that the Maria Lugones intellectual legacy of respectful world traveling to each other's worlds will continue. With that said, this is the first annual Maria Lugones lecture in philosophy and critical thought, and we're very excited to announce that there will be many more to come. And now I have the honor of introducing Patricia Baquedano Lopez.
Thank you. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Gabriela Veronelli. She received her bachelor's degree in political science at the Universidad de Buenos Aires, her master's degree in philosophy and translation studies at Binghamton University, and her doctorate in philosophy, interpretation, and culture, also at Binghamton University. Reading Dr. Veronelli's work, one becomes trained to hear the echoes of Maria Lugones' styles and argumentation, but there are new resonances, new tonalities, inviting deep thinking about decolonial communication. Her writings explore the relationship between language and power in colonial situations, advocating the radically different perspective of colonized traditions on language, understanding, expressivity, and meaning-making at the point of encounter. Her work has been published in Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy, Polyphonia, Ouagadougou, a journal of transnational women and gender studies, among many others. Dr. Veronelli has been a researcher and an affiliate of important centers and universities engaged in critical thought, including the Center for Global Studies and the Humanities at Duke University, the Instituto de Altos Estudios Sociales at Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Argentina, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Philosophy, Interpretation, and Culture, also at Binghamton. Her interests span a wide array of fields, including Latin American and Andean philosophy, decolonial theory, race and ethnicity, cultural theory, social linguistics, the politics of women of color theory, language and communication, and the Modernity, Coloniality, Decolonial Collective project. It is her work in these last two strands where she articulates theorizations of decolonial communication, inviting us to understand communication processes as forms of, quote, obscured discursive oppression. In her 2016 Hypatia article, a coalitional approach to theorizing decolonial communication, she notes clearly that coloniality closes the possibility of dialogue and dialogical creations of meaning. The move is to decolonize, to decentralize logos, because colonial language and speech, she argues, pretend to be purely rational and unable to recognize emotional elements. In fact, she says, unable to recognize worlds of meaning not being met by modern colonial communication. As a student of philosophy in the philosophy department at Binghamton University, she worked with Maria Lugones intellectually, but also she worked sharing the bond of family as Maria Lugones' niece. I will let Dr. Veronelli tell us a bit about that moment, but before that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gabriela Veronelli.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I prepare a few words to honor Maria Lugones, especially giving this new fellowship under her name, and then I will move to the highlights of my presentation. Maria Lugones said that racialization and resistance to racialization provoke a doubling that makes for multiple realities. She said that this is that she shared with other racialized people. She said that in being racialized, people have ways of lives, of being a people that include ways of communicating, particular relational arrangements, and ways of understanding one another as fully human. And she believed that the system of higher education was a menace to the communal sense of self, for it has the potential to change people of color, putting us in situations in which we have to mimic, assimilate, take in the knowledges and ways of speaking that are dominant, the knowledges of those who are and have always been understood as fully human, subjects who speak with legitimate authority and can assume they will be understood. And the academy can communicate with us, expecting that we will understand because of this change. Maria Lugones inhabited the spaces of the university resistantly, to take a class with her, to do research in her collaboration, to prepare a conference with her, to organize a workshop with her, like an antidote against the menace, was to be in a space of profound transformation, personal and social, against our dispositions to give in and assimilate to power. A transformation so as not to inhabit that space together, decolonially, for a reconstitution of the communal. Maestra y ahora ancestra, ancestor, aquí among us, together aquí among all the young and the not so young intelectuales comprometidas, intellectual activists of colors, among our struggles and projects to enjoy our freedom. Aquí se queda tu querida presencia, ni clara ni transparente, impura y peregrina. Okay, so now I will, give me a minute, I will move to my paper. In exploring the linguistic dimensions of coloniality and how the coloniality of language affects the possibility of dialogue among those who fight for social and epistemic justice from the same side, but from different localities of the colonial difference, I have focused on decolonial thought and praxis that work for decolonizing communication. This is the piece that I share with you and you read. Most recently, I have been exploring critical applied linguistics and decolonizing linguistic strategies coming out from different projects and communities. I collaborate with a Brazilian South African think tank on multilingualism, linguistic citizenship and vulnerability housed at the University of Western Cape. And here in the US, I am working and learning with the great Ofelia Garcia from the research group Sustaining Latinx Bilingualism at CUNY. And because I have been curating the translation of Lugones' Pilgrimages into Spanish, I had the opportunity to read it again in depth. And I have begun to connect Lugones' ontological pluralism and her theory of praxis of complex communication with the project of rethinking the role of multilingualism in furthering epistemic justice and reconstituted the communal. Why multilingualism? Because both within and outside of classroom, campuses, and universities in the US, all the Americas and worldwide, language and languaging practices continue to be ranked and regulated in ways that privilege communication and knowledge production through European languages. Among these, English. We all have felt some instance of this linguistic dispossession, como te sacan la lengua, how the epistemic authority is removed from you as a speaker of a colonized language. Todos tenemos experiencias y memorias y sentires y cantares of being oppressed, resisting con la lengua. I have argued that the role of language and dialogue in furthering decolonization and epistemic justice is comprised by the understanding of language inherited from the colonial project. I have called this inheritance the coloniality of language. Decolonization is in part about going beyond the coloniality of languages. And when it comes to multilingualism, this implies engaging with epistemologies from where to rethink ideas of multilingualism and the very notion of language itself. I have begun to read Lugones this way. A little bit of historical frame. The question of the role of language in reconstituting the communal cannot be detached from the uses to which language and knowledge have been put in a politics of globalized coloniality, an epistemic monoculture that is ingrained in all relations and systems of oppression, and where language has had a central role as a way of realizing and rationalizing these oppressions as just and benevolent. Historically, colonial ideologies and practices of languages play an important role in building the colonized self. I call them monolanguaging ideologies and practices, dehumanizing institutions, laws, and uses of language that position colonized people in situations and relations that stripe them of their humanity, such as the early modern linguist perception and representation of indigenous languages in animalistic terms that suggests these languages were incapable of expressing ideas that the European thought were integral to being being a full human being. As simple communicators, indigenous speakers were removed from the complexities of thought and expression necessary for life, and thus require patronage and government. Colonial languages were also the foremost tools in the interpellation of a colonized other. Colonial languages determine the legitimate forms of interaction and engagement among colonizers and colonized that have continued until the present. The ideology and practice of linguistic dehumanization occurs in pernicious ways here, taking shape in the expectations of what characterizes a normative speaker in control of organizing and signifying a normative organization of the colonial society. The colonized cannot inhabit the position of normative speaker, doesn't matter what language she speaks. Even if she speaks the colonizer language, the extent of complexity of linguistic coloniality layer into the historical formation of this language, so that the communicative conditions created by coloniality restrict building connections of dialogue, even in what is ostensibly the same language. Importantly, colonial languages were cultivated as repository of indigenous knowledges through tools of translation. Colonizing translation rewrote indigenous knowledges in idioms that made available to colonizers frames for making sense, interacting with, and managing words of difference. Colonizing translation rendered invisible everything that did not fit the parameters of modernity, thereby laying the basis for universality of Eurocentric knowledge and normativity of voice. We have countless examples of how the contemporary resonances of linguistic coloniality on the subject formation go far beyond accents or grammars or lexicons. English-only laws are just one, but one manifestation. Standardization is another. Both are linked to the long-standing modern colonial ideology that presume the primordiality of the one language, one nation, one people construct. This monolingual political imaginary has informed the emergence of modern state, and its ongoing hegemony is reflected in the widespread belief in the US context and elsewhere that monolingualism is the natural human state of being. In one way or another, we all know about this in our bodies and in our tongues. And historically, we have fought. In our classrooms and campuses, students and faculty and staff have risen against the many faces of linguistic coloniality. This Latinx Research Center, the new Maria Lugones Undergraduate Fellowship in Philosophy and Critical Thought, the Roundtable for Latina Feminism, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Philosophy, Interpretation, and Culture, are all efforts of people that have un saber encarnado de cuánto y cómo epistemic monoculture, epistemic monolingualism, and epistemic monolanguages are forms of oppression. Inside and outside our classrooms and campuses, we work to shift the center of conversation to people of color voices and conversations, to indigenous voices and conversations, because we know that otherwise our students cannot move from being the self who is centered in the Eurocentric monoculture tradition. I invite you to think of these efforts in terms of multilingualism. In doing so, we can venture into decolonizing epistemologies that offer conceptual framings of language that disengage coloniality and shift the perception of what constitutes knowledge. These take a variety of shapes. these decolonial epistemologies of languages. First, within the framework of indigeneity, decolonizing epistemologies of languages are about reclamation. For nearly 400 years, colonial languages have displaced indigenous languages in public spaces. Native languages were systematically and literally cut off indigenous people's tongues as they came in contact with and were forced to assimilate to colonial languages and cultures within and outside colonial schools. Many indigenous languages perished along with indigenous public displays of cultural and spiritual practices. Indigeneity, decolonial praxis, as expressed in Leanne Simpson's work on resurgence, for example, reflects a commitment to the sustainability of culturally specific ways of knowing and being as reflected in language, and works for recording and revitalizing Nishnabeg and other Turtle Island languages as part of healing and regenerating the creative, the cultural and political resources necessary for life. Another strand of language decolonial praxis follows mid-20th century decolonizing epistemologies like that of Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who argue that rejecting colonial languages were necessary to the process of decolonizing the mind. For Ngugi, writing in English was tantamount to alienation, and thus he chose to publish much of his work in his native Gikuyu. And lastly, the strand of language decolonization that I am exploring with Lugones, which operates from the epistemological assumptions of plurality, hybridity, and impurity, and argues for an attitude of ambiguity and uses of the vernacular that theorize the transgressive. These are the decolonizing epistemologies rethinking language and multilingualism by those who have been erased and disappeared by the ontology of the national. Mexicanas, Chicanas, Tejanas like Ansaldúa, and non-diasporic Latinas like Lugones, who dwell in the Lyman, the borderlands of multiple colonized territories. In Pilgrimages, Lugones thinks of language and uses language against the modernist idea of a contained logocentric system. Also, her languaging moves away from themes in which identity and cultural pride take center stage. Most notably, Lugones' decolonizing languaging transcends the limitations of border languages by incorporating multiple words of sense, and by tantear for a multiplicity of meanings in ethical engagements with different others in ways to see and hear their active subjectivity. And there is also her playfulness to handle opacity, uncertainty, and incommensurability. Lugones' ontological pluralism includes new ontologies of speaker and languages, where the idea of language and speaker is shifted in a process of complex communication. As such, I am looking in how it can open the door to a way of rethinking a notion and practice of multilingualism that moves beyond named languages and creates new languages practices that are different from a synthesis or a mixture or even code switching. This will be a notion and a practice of multilingualism capable of grasping and engaging with two-way or multi-way exchanges of knowledge in tension with each other, like the bilingual message that Lugones tells us about in the introduction of Pilgrimages, that is directed to both those who speak both languages, those who only speak the dominant language, and those who only speak the subaltern one. As such, I think Lugones' decolonial epistemology will open the possibility for a notion and practice of multilingualism that is a transformative epistemology and methodology of different. But I let you know how it goes because I'm just beginning with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And there we go. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. PJ DiPietro. I met them several years ago during one of our conversations at that time. PJ taught me something that has stayed with me all these years, and I want to share that experience with you all. We were meeting in a crowded Berkeley cafe, and I squeezed my chair on one side to open a space for people. PJ saw the situation and very casually just mentioned the importance of our bodily space, and that I had the right to own it, to own the space of our bodies. And that has stayed with me all these years. And I mentioned this kind of personal experience to highlight that today we have the privilege to have with us not only a first-class scholar, but also an amazing human being. On a more academic tone, Dr. DiPietro works at the intersection of decolonial feminism, women of color thinking, Latinx studies, and trans studies. They are assistant professor and graduate studies director at the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the Syracuse University in New York. Their transdisciplinary approach engages anthropology, human geography, and philosophy.
So very much, Cecilia. It's a great pleasure to have been introduced by you. Thank you. First, I had prepared a prezi with the actual text that I'm reading, but I think we can share that with the attendants afterwards. I don't know why I'm feeling like I'd like to actually go for it, and hopefully it works that way. I want to thank first the Latinx Research Center, all of the staff members, the members of the DK Collective, and I also want to thank Dr. Laura Elisa Perez, whose mentorship and guidance over the years I have very much cherished and continue to cherish. It's wonderful to be with you and in the presence of this co-panelist. Thank you for your generosity and companionship over the years. I see 365 people with us. I'm a little bit overwhelmed, but I guess that's also what Maria Lugones inspired in us, this type of sociality. I'm going to talk about communal selves, gendering and ungendering. The living witnesses of the aftermath of colonialism continue to teach us what it means to dwell in oppositional embodiments. They teach us the praxis of negotiating life, vitality, from within the domain of dehumanization. Against legacies of conquest, they generate ecologies of social permeabilities, not quite human, not quite monstrous, and yet not quite animal. I am speaking to you from Syracuse, New York, the land of the Haudenosaunee people. In the life work that I undertake, I shift my attention to this social and decolonial production of atypical and non-conforming embodiments across Latinx and Latin American communities. I follow the flesh of non-being under coloniality. This flesh is peopled, but this peoplehood does not register the neoliberal self-fashioning individual, nor does it fit into the post-human hopes of cyborgs, nor does it quietly settle in the new typicality of transgender. Within the Western hegemonies of sex and gender, the notion of transgender points to the propelling force that steers bodily orientations beyond their current limits. Trans and its permeability contest the typical reality of the subject. However, the carnal reality of non-being lacks the typicality of both the modern subject's impermeability and contemporary transgender bodies' permeability. It is key for a decolonial epistemology to question typicality of embodiments, whether impermeable or permeable. Beneath the animal and beneath the human, embodiments offer new ways of thinking, new ways of being with and becoming impermeable. In the year following my mother's passing, my family found an outlet for our shared trauma in the advice of one of the local curanderas, healers. She was an indigenous Toba woman in her older years. She came from the region of the intermountainous valleys of the Bolivian-Argentinian plateau. The slow and winding way in which my mother's vital fire had left her body made my family acutely sensitive to the precarious condition of the flesh. I did not quite get it back then, but injustice played a role in her ailing health. In hindsight, it was sort of understandable that when I was tucked in at night, lying in bed, I used to visualize otherworldly interventions that could have kept my mother's fire and light burning. The decolonial has allowed me to access this repository of subjugated knowledge. It makes me more aware of the ways that the practice of summoning an intangible and auspicious elsewhere is steeped deep in indigenous philosophies. For the most part, the healer's gift as fire whisperer synced our everyday life to the sacred reality of embodiment and well-being. She talked about habits and habituation and about learning how to read the habits of flesh, but also of clouds, winds, and shadows. They may show signs of our alignment or misalignment with nature. Her philosophy differentiated between nature and naturalization, which is, as many of us know, an instrument for the coupling of racist eugenics views and medical anxieties about cisgender norms. I invite you to notice that there are key elements in the relationality that supports the role of the fire whisperer within the community in which I grew up. To the Western mentality, most of these elements are irrelevant. To the mixed race, brown, gender non-conforming person that I have become and I'm becoming, these elements cross hemispheric borders as a repository of subjugated knowledges. The curandera showed us that arriving at a communal inhabitation of embodiment lies at the core of an indigenous, non-Western understanding of the self. I don't think that the fire whisperer conveys her sense of the communal through the idea of having a community to lean on. Instead, she summons the communal through her practice. In fact, her family and mine did not share community with each other. She had come into our lives through a series of exchanges, each expressing that our bodies' skins did not end at their edges. She had taught us that my mother's fire demanded the practice of some type of interdependency, which included not just the healer and an alien patient, but the patient's family and the clouds and the winds and shadows and other life forms such as homemade remedies and potions. Thinking and living communally taught me to mine the social for an inhabitation of selves in relation. From within this domain of subordinated knowledges, impermeability, impressibility gained salience as the decolonial matrix for embodied possibilities. I began by reflecting on the ways that permeability assembles communal selves and embodiments. I now turn to this philosophy for what it may tell us about non-conforming embodiments in opposition to the Western hegemonies of heterosexualism and cis-sexism. When I was about 7 years old, a few months before my mom passed away, I found myself kneeling in front of our family's rosary. Practitioners of Catholicism use this string of beads for praying and devotional purposes. My mother had hung the rosary over the wall of the living room. She called my dad to attend this makeshift contrition ritual and then instructed me to tell the reason behind my tribulations. I reiterated to my dad what I had earlier confessed to my mother. I had been missing for about an hour that late afternoon. During that time, my neighbor and I had gone into his father's camper, and with playfulness, we had rubbed each other's bodies. We had touched each other's skins and caressed each other. I vividly remember this makeshift confession ritual because it felt like an emotional imprint taking residency within me. The confession was meant to suppress my experience of manyness, of an embodiment that I could no longer call my own. My performance of atonement, though, made me even more aware of the fleshy folds that, since then, I have failed to numb down. The subjugated philosophy of the fire whisperer allows me to link embodied manyness to impressibility. The latter is the condition of being affected by another. Consider, for instance, one slice in the life story of Roxana Hernandez, a stateless trans woman originally from Honduras who died in ISIS custody due to lack of proper medical attention. Let us focus on the relationship that sound materialized between her and the neighborhood in which she lived before she was pushed to join the asylum-seeking migrant caravan of 2018. Sound remained in her embodiment as an impressible infrastructure, whereby cis-sexism perpetrated torture against the have-nots. According to BuzzFeed, a gang with ties to the local cartel raped Roxana. During the assault, they screamed, warning here for what I'm going to repeat. Quote, "We don't want you in this neighborhood, you fucking faggot," end quote. The hegemonies of globalizing capitalism rehearse compounds violence on trans Latinx migrant bodies. The violent assault occupies the sonic matter of impressibility. Both language and scream materialize the uncanny meeting of toxic fixation and transphobia. Impressibility actualized, on the one hand, anxiety about the bodily boundaries upon which sound trespassed, and on the other, violent exhilaration about the carnal circuitry that rape corrupted. Within each of the assemblages that I have asked you to journey with me, I recognize different aspects of communal selves. The plurality of flesh that emerges from the vital fire to which indigenous healers speak, the messy play of intimacy between two kids, or the sonic circuitry between Roxana and her exile into the migrant caravan. My act of contrition before the rosary entails an injunction against the permeability of flesh. If the touch of my neighbor multiply the carnal habituations of the flesh in which I reside, the rosary denounces the weaknesses that leave me outside the hierarchical human building binary of masculinity, femininity. Less than human, disabled, debilitated, I have learned, as much as Roxana did, to wear somebody else's skin. We have come to habituate our flesh to realities other than those of typical humans or typical animals. The violence both Roxana and I face is an attempt at displacing the intimate terror that we manifest for many as reminders of what it means to slip down the non-human, neither man, nor woman, nor animal decline. I'm almost done. A specific and situated form of embodied germination, transing manifest bodily permeability. Transing, not transgender, transing. Not unlike the circle of embodiments that the fire whisperer taught us to foster, transing threatens the subject's typical boundaries. Transing may at times register as less than human, crippled, or monstrous. The healer whose advice my family followed introduced me to an awareness of the ineffable mysteries of the flesh, particularly of transing flesh. Her way of habituating our embodiments to transgress metaphysical categories, the inside-outside split, for example, has an eerie tone. Due to the many technological and social developments that foreground the plasticity and flexibility of embodiments, the 21st century celebrates what has once been understood as monstrous or physically handicapped. Contemporary politics and epistemology offer this celebration to both trans and transgender embodiments. We're being tempted, seduced. For their capacity to contest the understanding of the body as discrete and without ambiguity, trans embodiments function as gatekeepers of the impressible boundaries of the typical subject. They are trans and transgender, performing the fusion between gender nonconforming and near human, monstrous bodies. However, trans embodiments have seldom tapped into the native and indigenous philosophies that the fire whisperer summons. The Western paradigm of sex-gender mistakes the ineffable mysteries of trans in flesh for monstrous and celebrated trans embodiments. The Western paradigm privileges the human and its bodily deviation. The self-fashioning individual of permeable and transgender bodies blocks those cosmologies whereby transing comes to reside among communal, germination-producing selves. The decolonizing epistemology that I practice centers communal selves and points and posits that transgender and therefore the dominant genealogies of transgender studies do not quite depart the human-centered paradigm of sex gender. The genealogies of trans studies that remain kindred to the communal weave together intersectional, decolonial, anti-racist, transnational, and intercultural feminist thinking and philosophy and theologies, as Laura Perez says, specifically because of the ways that they help us differentiate between 1, gendering and ungendering, 2, the light and the dark sides of heterosexualism, and 3, the monstrous deviations of the human and the vestibular flesh of infrahuman embodiments. Thank you so very much.
Muchas gracias, PJ. I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Mariana Ortega. And I do have a personal story. Mariana, when she gave a talk at Berkeley, when Laura invited her, I came out of the lecture and I went to her talk and then we went to dinner, and I was kind of frustrated. And I was frustrated at my students because I caught one Snapchatting me. That's when Snapchat was all the rage, and I was telling Mariana how I was getting Snapchatted with the little with the perrito with the tongue that comes out. So I'm like giving a lecture, and Mariana busts out laughing for like 5 minutes straight. I'm like, I really wanted to bond with my intellectual hero, but she laughed at me for 5 minutes straight and humbled me, and it was a great experience. but Mariana is that kind of energy. She has helped me understand my work better. She's helped me understand philosophy in general better. Heidegger, Sartre, all the existentialists. In a recent article that she wrote, it's called Spectral Perception and Ghostly Subjectivity. She asked a question at the beginning of the article, and she says, "How does one see that which is not supposed to be seen in its condition of invisibility, spectrality, and of imaginary being?" And she goes on to propose for us to dwell with the ghosts. But I also want to propose that, you know, in order to answer her own question, I think we need to all really dwell with Mariana Ortega's work on multiplicity, on phenomenology, on existentialism, and we can find that answer because her work is radical. It'll answer questions that you haven't even asked yet. Mariana, she works in Latinx feminism, phenomenology, critical philosophy of race and aesthetics. She's the author of In Between Latina Feminist Phenomenology, Multiplicity, and the Self, published in 2016. She's the co-editor with Andrea Pitts and Jose Medina of Theories of the Flesh, Latinx and Latin American Feminism, Transformation and Resistance, published in 2020. And she's the co-editor with Linda Martin Alcoff of Constructing the Nation, a Race Nationalism Reader, published in 2009, and the co-founder and director of Latinx Feminism Roundtable. So please help me welcome Mariana Ortega.
Thank you. Thank you, Abraham. I'm going to share my screen. The first thing that I would like to do is to thank Laura Perez and all the members of the Latinx Research Center for making this event possible. I would like to thank PJ, Gabriela, and Chela for being here and for their amazing work. I would like to thank the wonderful students that I have right now in my graduate seminar where we're reading the methodology of the oppressed in a very in-depth way. And I would like to thank the audience for coming today. I look forward to your questions. And a very special thanks to Maria Lugones for the world travels that she's making possible for us. May we continue walking with her. I would like to start with the words of Alma Villanueva. There seems to be a question of survival here, a question of reinventing love, feeling. It goes on, extends. It touches what language never reaches. We speak the language of blood. And Chela Sandoval, the act of falling in love can thus function as a punctum, that which breaks through social narratives to permit a bleeding, meanings unanchored and moving away from their traditional moorings, a gentle hemorrhage of being. Here, I wish to speak of blood, flesh, bones, and sensuous art making, a type of cartographic art praxis that puts us in an existential, temporal, spatial location, in a map of being and sensing, the kind of art that pricks us, as if with cactus needles, as Gloria Anzaldúa would say, and allows us to make and transform ourselves and our worlds. And I wish to make epistemology feel through images that can decolonize ways of knowing and being. The words of Gloria Ansaldúa, María Lugones, Chela Sandoval, and Laura Perez direct me, move me, take me to spaces of sensing, hoping, and making in red. Fierce yet gentle hope for other ways of being, embodied thinking and perceiving, of world making in the midst of feeling brown, which, as Muñoz lovingly reminds us, means, and I quote, feeling together in difference, end of quote. With Ansaldúa, Lugones, and existential phenomenology, I have been led to the multiplicitous self, a self that stands in many worlds, seeing with many eyes, traveling from one world to another, a self that is amasamiento, a creature of darkness, a creature of light, multiple and one, as Ansaldúa says. Lately, I spent a lot of time with images, with art in its various forms, and I'm inspired by Lugones' call for a decolonial feminism, and Sandoval's early call for a methodology of love. Love as that punctum that leaves us bleeding for justice. I refashion Maria's call for decolonial feminism and add that it cannot stay only within the realm of discourse, but that it needs to engage the sensorium found in images. I call for a decolonial feminism that sees not just with a pair of lonely eyes, but with the whole body, as Merleau-Ponty teaches us. And I search for a new aesthetics, or rather an aesthesis that is bloody, carnal, that includes the sensuousness of the artistic process and all the knowledge that it offers. In short, I look for the differential moment in artistic process and production that can mobilize us to perceive differently. I wish for an aesthesis of the limit, a multisensorial engagement with various elements. Yes, the essential ones, earth, water, wind, fire, so as to forge one's bones and make one's identity by combinations of oil and pigment, fire and sand, and photography, the so-called writing with light. I look for, as Laura Perez says, and I quote, a decolonizing visual gallery of the socially wrong who are pure of heart, end of quote. But let us look at art. This is a poem by Leonora de Barros. And here, this is the entire piece. And so you can see more of the details of each panel. In poem, mouth, letter, metal, paper intertwined to disclose different relations of what we may call being in words, an onto-existential condition in which the mouth or hands or the whole body wish to communicate, the ontological condition of being a self that is formed by disclosure. If we think of being in words as one of the existential conditions of the self, we can interpret Barros' poem as disclosing a self in the making that must make words, sounds, expressions, gestures, so as to create, transform, and reconfigure herself and worlds. I look at Barros' poem and my body tenses and imagines the pain of a trapped tongue, or is it a painful seduction? I hear the sound of the type bars, metallic and cold, rising so as to clasp a delicate yet powerful tongue, my own, and those of the atravesados who are not allowed to speak. This poem, written with light, speaks, seduces, and pierces. The punctum of a tongue stretched thin, pulled by cutting metal that demands expression, but also hurts. While paralyzing, poem also moves me to speak, if not words, other disclosures that bring to light Latina, Latinx bodies naming themselves by way of the aesthetic, not the cold, disinterested, traditional aesthetic, but a differential aesthesis, a multi-sensory process of self-creation of what I call auto-arte, in the in-between space inhabited by mouths, bodies of bone, flesh, and blood. Auto-arte is about making and transforming oneself and our worlds through the sensuous process of artistic creation. It is a mouth that speaks and that writes with light. In a decolonial move that problematizes the linearity of written scripts, Anzaldúa claims that images precede language. These images, she says, are like animals that we need to tend to. They lead to the source of imagination. Spirit, bones, blood, and guts mix here. Anzaldúa says, and I quote, "Without imagination, transformation would not be possible. Without creativity, other epistemologies, those of the body, dreams, intuitions, and senses, other than the 5 physical senses, would not reach consciousness." I wish to follow these loving animals. I think of Alma Villanueva's call for reinventing love, of Sandoval's love as committed, ethical, oppositional social action, a love that gives us new tongues. What about this kind of love? I see one work from the series Las Camas by Colombian artist Felisa Burstein, and I think of the reinvention of love in all its sensuous modes, in its erotics, in the manner that Audre Lorde calls, that luscious, vibrantly red, silky, undulating, draping over what? Bodies in ecstasy, bodies sharing the bed in a gentle, harmonious intertwining that discloses their innermost feelings and vulnerabilities, that hold each other tight even when the world is ending. Bodies in hiding. What is being disclosed here in its very invisibility? Is it a disclosure or a covering up? A censoring of bodies that move in sinful ways, bodies that need to be stopped so as to save the children and us from such perversions. Sensuousness needing to be curtailed for the purpose of the church and state. Yet, am I also being invited to swim in that sea of redness underneath? You see, this bed moves and it makes sounds. Burstein has added levers and mechanical parts that produce movement under that alluring cover. Have our bodies been turned into machines, or are we being made machines by the hungry, ruthless state whose infamous apparatuses of ideology interpolate our very being? This bed no longer has clear meanings, clear desires, clear offerings. There's an opening here. An opening for resignification, for the meta-ideologizing that Chela Sandoval reminds us is needed for the hermeneutics of love. You see, that bond between signifier and signified that offers a meaning-laden sign does not just dwell within the world of this discourse, it bleeds too. It calls for our sensuousness, for our desire either to colonize the world or to create it anew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for that beautiful multi-tonal multimedial, multisensorial engagement with us and for sharing those amazing pieces of work, including your own beautiful paintings. Thank you so much for that. I'll now introduce our next speaker. It is not always that we deeply respect and care for the whole person as much as we respect and care for their intellectual and other contributions. But I do so for each and every one of our panelists today. And this is so for our next speaker. Chela Sandoval is the author of The Tour de Force, Methodology of the Oppressed, charting the complexity of thought and action of US women of color, consciousness, analysis, theory, and practices suggested by her concepts of differential consciousness, differential movement, methodology of the oppressed, and decolonial love. This is a work in which she places into conversation some of the most important thinkers of the progressive West: Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Donna Haraway, and others. She places these wonderful thinkers and allies in conversation with the powerful thought of US women of color, multimodal thinkers. And she contextualizes the crucial work of the French and Euro-American thinkers as only possible because of the anti-colonial movements of the 1950s, whether attributed or not, and emphasizes the continuation of that anti-colonial movement among people of color in the United States, especially the feminist and queer thought of Indigenous, African-American, Asian American, Chicana, and other US Latina women of color thinkers. Her generosity, compassion, commitment to coalitionary thought and action, and her courage, alongside her capacious, luminous mind, heart, spirit, are all manifest in that great work. A work that is recognized throughout the world of thinkers, artists, and activists committed to social justice struggles who center the experiences of the colonized, the once colonized, and the still negatively racialized, gendered, sexed, and oppressed. Her new work centers decolonizing consciousness and practice through the SWAPA methodology of witnessing each other. I am honored to introduce you now to Chela Sandoval. Chela, you're on mute.
It's a good thing I was on mute because I had goosebumps all the way through your presentations, and I am awed by this introduction. Thank you, Laura. And I'm reminded of the way in which Maria Lugones made the effort to bring Laura and I and Gabriela and DiPietro and Gabriela, Mariana did the same. Both of them, Maria Lugones and Mariana Ortega here, made the effort to take us from the West Coast, at least Laura and I, and bring us all together to the East Coast many years ago to be in company with one another. And this company that I'm with now, the five of you, means so much to me that we're coming together again in honor of Maria, but also in honor of the connections we all made with one another. A long time ago, Laura, what year was it when the Mapping the Decolonial Turn conference happened?
I'm not sure what year that was. I know I know we brought, Gabriela sabe, I know we brought María in 2007, si no mal me recuerdo.
It was 2005 because that's the year I met Chela.
Oh, okay, when we first met was 2007. But now I'm talking not about our initial meetings, but I'm talking about a conference that was held at UC Berkeley where Lugones came. Laura, you were there. None of the rest of you were there, but who was there? It was called Mapping the Decolonial Turn, Post-Continental Interventions, Post-Continental Interventions, and indeed transcontinental interventions in philosophy, theory, and culture. The kind of post-continental intervention created, for example, by the short-lived but planetary Third World Liberation movement of the 50s and 60s. There were many speakers at that conference that included María, you, Laura, Enrique Dussel, Louis Gordon, Sylvia Winters, Catherine Walsh, Anibal Quijano, Ramon Grossfogel, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and I'm leaving out more names than I can include. It was 15, I don't know, years, 20 years ago. Can you hear me? When it was my turn to speak about the book Methodology of the Oppressed, or MOTO, as my dear friend, Professor Alicia Gaspar de Alba calls it, MOTO, I decided to experiment by leading the conference attendees, unsuccessfully I might add, in a ceremony that US Third World Feminists called Shape-Shifting, Witnessing, Shape-Shifting, a ceremony. Using a small but important technique drawn from the practice of SWAPA, which is an acronym for Storytelling, Witnessing as World Art Performance. Storytelling, Witnessing as World Art Performance become activism. I asked each conference participant to jot down one word, idea, or concept from my performance that day that mattered to them. At the end of the talk, and then at the end of the talk, to give witness, to give their jotted down word, idea, or concept back to me and to the group. This process, to give back what one hears as clearly as possible, give it back, and perhaps give your feeling about it, is a very basic structure to practitioners of nonviolent communication, such as Thich Nhat Hanh, which is patterned and practiced in order to help participants disengage from the social physics of war. It's hierarchical. I call up Nelson Maldonado Torres here. And to disengage from the social physics of war, its hierarchically organized formations of power, from the coloniality of power, to disengage from what Lugones long ago called our, quote, patterned agonistic attitudes toward play, toward social exchange, toward ourselves and one another, which she posits are what circulate in place of the social physics of love. I had never before tried introducing this part of the technique, of the SWAPA technique, to a large audience in a conference setting, but I felt compelled to try it as an experiment. This call and response procedure enacted in community represents a very small but crucial part of what I now list as the sixth technology of the methodology of the oppressed, now a methodology of emancipation. Because for those of you who have read MOTO, it is clear that the first 5 technologies, methods, procedures, whatever you want to call it, that I list there, can only be engaged on behalf of social justice when they're engaged and practiced in community. The 6th technology of MOTO, when used in conjunction with the previous 5, allows another thread of our social physics, the social physics of love, to rise in the fabrication of psychic and cultural being, of cultural and psychic being. The very social physics Fanon referred to when he said that he believes in a form of social, that he believes that a form of social love is possible. And that is why he works to trace its perversions, its sublimations. This is the very social physics of love upon which Gandhi and Martin Luther King built whole social movements, and for which third world feminists, such as Merle Wu in 1980, advocated when she wrote in a letter to her mother that she said, quote, "I feel like I can begin to put our lives in a larger framework. The outline for third world feminists are time and blood. But today there's a breadth possible through making connections with others involved in community struggle. We American women of color," she says, "can make a new framework that will not support repression, hatred, exploitation, and isolation, but instead we can create a human and beautiful framework created in community, a community that does not need to be bonded by color, sex, class, age, gender," she writes, "but bonded through another framework, a social love that can liberate minds, hearts, bodies, lands, and spirit." That was in 1980. So for those of you who have not seen Moto, my book, or for those of you who have and have forgotten, I want to quickly summarize its 5 recommended procedures, technologies, or methods used within US third world feminist gatherings. The first I now call biosemiology, reading signs through the body. That's the only way it can happen. A method you're all familiar with, the one where we read, decode socially constructed, historically constructed signs and codes in order to determine where to stand, in order to ensure our survival and the survival of our communities and families and more. This basic method is used to radically reconceive and intervene in dominant hierarchical patterns used for thinking, doing, being, architecture, behavior, loving. Biosemiology aids practitioners in watching the sensory effects of historically produced signs and coding systems on the body and its senses. Although Mariana says this so much better. That is to say, a biosemiology that forces its practitioner to pay attention to the sensory effect of signs and codes on perception, on the body and its senses, on the effects of ascesis, perception, as it moves through the body and calls upon our emotions and travels into mind, our minds, a process in relation to the body, mind, emotion matrix that occurs in any reading of signs, in all our readings of signs. Secondly, second technology, biosemiology as constituted in Moto is worked to either break open through the use of revolutionary artivism, the signs that ensure the hierarchical domination and subordination of others. And where poetry, that which breaks signs apart in order to liberate meaning itself, is, as Audre Lorde put it, not a luxury, it is a requirement. It is the second technology. Thirdly, I argued by building upon dominant signs in their wholeness, heaping upon them some other more dominating meaning in order to put weight on and force the oppressive meaning of a word to change. For example, like the early 20th century word used in the US to denigrate border crossers, Chicano, which is transformed in the 1960s into a word that legitimizes all forms of revolutionary border crossing. I describe this third mode as meta-ideologizing. Fourth, but to work on signs this way, to move their meanings through the social and through the mind, body, emotion matrix so as to break their patternings is not possible without the transformation of unified, solidified identity, transforming it into a flexible, mobile mode of consciousness called for by Jose Munoz in his theory of disidentification, and by Gloria Anzaldúa in her prescriptions for the development of a Nahuala formation of consciousness, one that allows signs to take their targeted places in identity and consciousness, even as the possibility for that transformation and movement tugs at the location where identity has landed. Those who can do so self-reflexively become, Gloria Anzaldúa says, the bridge makers, the nepantles. In the case of both of these theorists, Munoz and Anzaldúa, rising up in this possibility of another occupation for identity is a new subject of history, one who actively moves beyond the contemporary physics of the social and its inhabitants and creators. A time Marx once wrote that remains the prehistory of our species, even as Sylvia Winters portends the rise of other kinds of beings, as does PJ. Indeed, as Foucault wrote in the 1990s, the hope for the 21st century is not that we find out what we are, but to undo what we have become. And bell hooks, the point is not to self-actualize, she says, but to de-self-actualize. In my book, Methodology of the Oppressed, I call this fourth technology a differential perception. And then fifth, finally, I argued each technology, each of these previous four technologies must be guided by an ethical commitment to egalitarianism. An ethical technology I called democratics in moto, because any of these technologies can be used to sell advertising. If they're not guided by an ethical commitment one is conscious, aware of, and self-reflexively using. In 1992, at that map, I think it must have been 2003, that conference, at the Mapping the Decolonial Turn Post-Continental Philosophy Conference at Berkeley, I spoke to the necessity of one additional technology, the one represented in the gatherings Anzaldúa spoke to in her 1980 letter to Third World women writers, and that Toni Cade Bambara celebrated in her introduction to the 1981 edition to This Bridge Called My Back, which described people, feminists of color, gathered to share dance, drumming, writing, speech, poetry, song, and lecture conversations that we now call theory, and what Anzaldúa later called ato, historia, teoria. Their gatherings became ceremonial, structured practices for communal exchange that allowed practitioners access to that space Audre Lorde described as a house of difference, and that Polygon Allen said is a decolonized place within which we now live, and wherein exchanges across very differing pasts, presents, and futures among those people could take place. A house of difference wherein many thinker-doers beyond Anzaldúa, Lugones, Alhibri, and Wu shared what Tracy Chapman in 1995 described when she wrote of today's civilizational crisis, that the whole world's broke. It ain't worth fixing. So we've got to make new signs, make new symbols, make new languages. And with these, we'll redefine the world and we can start all over. I described the gathering processes of 1970s and 80s US third world feminism as structured ceremonies at the 2003 Conference on the Generation of Post-Continental Thought and Philosophy. I described this ceremony as the sixth technology of the methodology of the oppressed, described by Bambara and Anzaldúa in 1981, as a calling up of a shaman witness ceremony, later as a Nawala witness, Nawala ceremony, and today I use the techniques generated in these gatherings when teaching the 5 technologies of methodology of the oppressed to young activists of color who teach me in our sessions far more than I teach them in our own structured gatherings of givers and witnesses, our work protected in ceremonies of shapeshifters, witnesses, shapeshifters. Today, in this electric, cyber connection, we are 400 people gathered in this house of difference, seeking to find common grounds, not through a unity that erases our differences, but through bringing into being another level of social physics and entities who can make that happen. The 6 technologies of moto is for those who seek to, as Lugones puts it, world travel, to love across the borders and enclosures of difference. It is to help us learn, she says, how to tango and play with power as an aesthetic, and where what we create is made through our abilities to meta-witness the powers of our own aestheses, and the ways this beingness moves with, to, and against power, the way this aestheses, our own aestheses, moves with, to, and against power, like the tango Gabriela and Lugones taught Laura and I one night so long ago, 2005, when they taught us how to when they taught Laura and I how to tango. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chela, and each and every one of you. I want to get the Q&A started because I know that people are eager to share with you, to speak with you. We already have comments in the chat from ex-students, from friends, from fellow travelers that we may not have met in person, but who are with us and sharing in the spirit of today's wonderful panel. I want to get this started with questions, and only because one of the things I was thinking of when our group organized this panel is that I really wanted to showcase the incredible work that, that you and others are doing, but I also wanted people to not feel intimidated, right, by these words, the decolonial, the epistemic, even from philosophy, which for some people has really been presented as a kind of a master, right, discipline. And so I wanted to just really ask you, why does the conversation, right, about the possibilities of the decolonial matter at this historical time from each of your diverse locations and from the perspective of the work that you have undertaken? So I would like to ask each of you if you could just address that, and then I want to move on then to the questions and comments from the rest of the people who are with us today. Por favor. Can I just start with, well, quien quiera, you know, just want to jump in, or should I choose?
Laura, can you repeat the question?
Yes, yes. So my question is, why, so we're talking about the decolonial, we're talking about epistemic decolonization in all of the work that we do. And so the question is a general one. Why does it matter right now? Why does it matter right now at this historical juncture to be thinking about the decolonial? Why? En cierta forma, la pregunta es, in a certain way, the question is, ¿qué es este esfuerzo decolonial, right? In a certain way, we're saying, well, what is this decolonial effort? Why are we talking about the epistemic? In what way does thinking about the decolonial matter at this time? And I'm asking from exactly where each of you work, which is slightly different places, you know?
Laura?
Sí, por favor, Mariana.
Yes, I think that is a great question to start a conversation with the audience, precisely because I think the term decolonial is being so widely used. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to recognize the very ways in which the term itself can become colonized or can become appropriated by neoliberal forces within academia, in the way that a lot of people are being pushed to add the word decolonial in their work in order for books to be sold. I think it's very important for us to be mindful of what I've called in a work, decolonial woes, right? But when we move away from this colonizing aspect of the decolonial movement, I think it is important for us, at least in the kind of work that I'm doing. I am realizing that discourse does not seem to be enough. That to reason with somebody about a position, to try to convince them that they're wrong or that their position is mistaken, and to give premises and to argue with them, to use words, to provide examples, to provide data, does not seem to be working. If anything, we know that a lot of people get more. There have been some studies that show that people get more, they become even more believers the more data you give them that says that they are mistaken. And so that's why I've been thinking in terms of decolonization. I've been thinking in terms of how images might perhaps touch the sensory aspects of our being, how sensuousness and the process of sensuousness as in perception in general, through work, through works of art, poetry, music, song, theater, how that might perhaps touch some people and open up spaces for them to think differently and to question their own views. And so for me, at this specific moment where I think that this course seems, I do not want to say that it's failing as it works in some ways, but it's not doing enough as we are trying to forge coalitions across differences. And so that's why I'm working with images and aestheses.
So thank you for the question, and Mariana for making us reflect or dwell longer in the meaning of the decolonial. I think that embodiment is the innermost dwelling of our possibilities, of interdependency, of a politics of love, of ways of healing, of caring for each other, of being, undoing the humans we were supposed to become and becoming other than human. But at the same time, I think that the temptation of the time in which we live is that the post-human enacts a new leveling force. And it works in very tricky ways that perpetuates the legacies, right, of empire, of conquest, of racism, so that we are at a time where, well, apparently we can move past, right? We can move past our boundaries. We can move past the master narratives, but we also can move past the many ways in which we have infused differences with political, radical praxis. So I think the decolonial, to me, I encountered the decolonial at that intersection of the failure of humanism and the failure of the post-human. And to me, that requires, well, much of the work that you all are doing, much of the work of decolonizing language, much of the work of decolonizing perception and the sensorial, and much of the work of socially producing otherwise possibilities for our bodies. So that brings me to the need to rethink materialisms in decolonial ways. So one of the things that has happened, at least in the feminist, and the trans feminist work that we find, and that is working very critical, important work, is that, and I'm not saying just work that you read in books. I'm talking also about the work that we see every day. And, people are checking on the internet how they're going to make sense of their typicality or atypicality. You know, they go to social media and they find GNC groups, or they find chats where they can talk with other folks about how to get hormones for, you know, to transition and go under, you know, the biotechnological or biopharmaceutical industrial complex and so on and so forth. So this is like critical. I mean, what bodies are we to become? What bodies are we to produce? It's about the materiality of the dwelling of our possibilities. So now one of the things that has happened is that it has also been co-opted. The possibility of the other than human has been co-opted, and it has been co-opted with all forms of neoliberal self-fashioning. With also, it has been co-opted with supracultural understandings of trans. It has also been co-opted by romanticizing of a trans past, so that you can look back and then find all of our sisterhood or sorority or brotherhood, etc. In all different modes, right? Different modes of responding, or technologies of responding to the challenge of mattering in a different way, in a way other than the human. And what I want to bring to the conversation is how do we get to engage communally in mattering in a way other than the posthuman, but also in a way other than the animal. Because when you look at least at the history of our folks, you know, the mixed race, indigenous folks in the Latinx Americas, we were treated not just as non-human, we were also treated as beneath animals. So we have to rethink, right? We have to rethink the beneath the human and beneath animals. So that's part of the materialism that I'm interested in, and I think is crucially decolonial.
I can answer very briefly to the question of why the decolonial matters. It matters because we still live in a colonial world. That, you know, and we all have, all that are here today, the 8 of us and the right now 254 people in the audience have understandings of that. Maybe not philosophically elaborated, but have the feeling in their body that we still live in a colonial world, and that the effects of colonialism are epistemic. That's why decolonizing epistemologies matter, because those effects would limit colonization to the modern understanding of colonization. We are doomed. So I think a point where as I see the decolonial being used in so many ways, for me, all these many ways do share, of course, not that they all think the same, but they do share an understanding of looking for alternatives in different communities, in different possibilities. And sometimes it's difficult to me when they put all our different strands of decolonization, like I was talking, right? Like you have Wationgo and you have Liam Simpson and what I'm trying now with Lugones against each other, right? Like that, again, that's the colonization of the mind, you know? So that's why we need the decolonial, because it is about really breaking away from the very narrow ways of thinking the possibilities of life, particularly because in those possibilities of life, we, people of color, are nothing.
Yes, Coachella, just unmute yourself. Thank you, Gabriela.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the word decolonial, like so many other terms in the academic world and everywhere, becomes jargonized. Another term that we can use. We want to break free of that. That's why Lugones's contribution, her essay on decolonizing feminism, which points out, as PJ has told us, the ways in which Lugones answers Sojourner Truth's question. When Sojourner Truth says, ain't I a woman? Lugones says, well, and the answer is not in the colonial society within which we live. In the colonized society within which we live, you're only a woman or human if you're a member of the colonizing class. If you're not in that colonizing class, you can be a human. You can be human. You can be a woman who is there to serve and uphold the white male as human, but you're still on the side of the human. On the other side, she says, is the category of the non-human, of the animal, and that is where people of color were seen as males and females, but not as, isn't that what she said? Males and females, but not as human. And so Lugones is telling us that this decolonial consciousness that comes out of feminist of color organizing happens on that side of the colonial break. She says that in each of us is that we represent a fractured locus. We are a locus, a center that has been fractured. And that is also a kind of site of the colonial wound itself, where we're pushed and pulled. She says, we're pulled on the one side to the side of oppressor and oppressed, to the side of dominators and victims. We're pulled to that side. And on the other side, we resist. We resist. But out of that colonial wound, that locus that has been fractured, rises another form, other forms of energy, other forms of being human, other kinds of sensorium that women of color have been writing about for a long time now, that we don't have names for, and that we have to keep changing the labels on, because we are, as Sylvia Winter's saying, creating other modes of being. We're at the end of the prehistory of the human as it was once known. We are in a civilizational crisis where this idea of decolonization, well, we see it, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We see our people rising out of that colonial wound with new forms of challenge, of expression, of being, on every level of being.
Thank you, Chela. We're going to move on into the questions of our audience. And maybe what we'll do is just have like one person, as quickly as seems reasonable, like answer. We'll try to skip over the questions that we think we have already touched on. And I'm gonna ask Abraham if he'll take the lead in helping us select through the questions that I think everyone has access to. I think that even the audience can see them. Abraham, por favor, would you help us with that or lead us in that?
Yeah, we have a question here from Macario Ortiz. We have two questions. What is the difference between building an epistemological paradigm of colonialism and deconstructing an internal colonial epistemological paradigm? Do beingness and being have the same meaning to the colonizer as to the colonized?
Super short in connection to at least what I presented today. Yes, right. So the notion of the communal selves, or sideways selves, as I call them elsewhere, this notion, right, taps into the underside of our repository of lived knowledge. lived experience articulated in a way that one pushes against our condition of non-being and maintains, supports, nurtures, fosters other ways of understanding selfhood, through language, through aesthesis, through, instead of aesthesis, through the sensorial and through embodiment. So what does it mean? So one of the things I am saying is trans, even though it manifests a possibility of moving against the typical boundaries of the human, right? It works, it fits within what you are calling, what the person who's asking, Macario, it works within the paradigm of the human. So trans, it works against it and yet fits. Yeah. Fits the human. So now then trans, as you are saying, can be a way of emphasizing being, or maybe what Professor Sandoval has called, certain forms of egalitarianism that are seeking duplication or assimilation into a rehabilitation of what is different into a pattern that is a Western pattern nonetheless. Yes. So maybe that's how I would respond. Indeed, I mean, the decolonial is kind of like that, like the outer edge of modernity. And there's at some point, there's, something gravitates there that is exterior to coloniality. And that's where what we're trying to name, call non-being and the differential, the radical poetics of love. Today is Audre Lorde's birthday. Jackie Alexander sent an email last night telling us that they are inducting her to the, St. John Cathedral in New York City, to the corner of American poets. So yeah, all of those have been ways.
PJ, estás muted.
So did I speak at all? So then I mute myself?
Sí, nomás como los últimos 30 segundos.
Oh no, I was saying that Jackie Alexander sent an email about, Audre Lorde induction in this, American poetry corner in St. John's Cathedral. That's my way of short.
Thank you, PJ. Chela, did you want to add something?
I think, no. I mean, yes, but no. It's
okay. It's just, okay. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
I wanted
Patricia.
to add.
Oh, it's Mariana, sorry.
I did want to add though that I think that one of the interesting part of the question, I think, is very suggestive, because the idea that comes out of this question is whether there's a possibility of rethinking what the colonizing metaphysical epistemology way of being is, and whether one can do it from the inside or it has to be on that other outer edge. And it seems to me that if we're going to think about decoloniality as having various genealogies, and if we are going to take seriously like the idea that decoloniality is an option and that there's a decolonial option, then it seems to me that we have to be open to the possibility that that moment of resignification can happen within what Chela talks about meta-ideologizing. That is to say that we take the empty forms we take the signifiers that have become empty of form, and they can be refilled for other purposes. And so it seems to me that here we have a difference of understanding what the limits of resistance are, within different views. For example, Lugones' position of resistance. She doesn't think that it is possible to do it from the inside, whereas other positions think that it's very possible to do the shifting from inside. And so it really depends on how we're thinking. And so here I think it's the idea of the differential that comes in, that that we have to be able to read the situation, whether it is even a possibility of that change from within. Or if it's not, then we have to be even more creative to come up with some other alternative ways of being.
Yes. Yes. To be able to differentially and tactically move between options. The important thing is to work in community to help so that we can work together to help determine what is the most effective move or tactic to take at in any particular situation or time.
I can just share a comment that I think also goes to one of the questions I see in the list, bringing this question about the insight, particularly when we are thinking about our universities, right? And what is that we are, how is the inside outside dwell in our universities by us, intellectual activists, right? Intelectuales comprometidas that occupy the space. And I think we have been battling, and I have this conversation with Lugones and other people, decolonial in the broad sense, about if it's possible to decolonize the university. And many of them, and I think I include myself with it, or I haven't have a resolution, I think that is not. That the reason that people of color go to the university is just to, learn how to be able to fight, but it is outside in our communities, in our projects, where our life makes sense. So I've been thinking that more and more, because I think it allows us to be a little bit more flexible with these insides and outsides. I think as Chela is saying, we occupy spaces strategically, but in terms of energy, I think my energy is on the, not so much in changing the inside, really but on the outside, if we follow that borders.
There's another question here that kind of follows that thread, Gabriela, by Ocon Carmen. I joined the space today seeking healing through the words and ideas you shared with all of us today in the midst of the embodied and spiritual hurt and democratic collapse. Thank you for your words, art, pensamientos. What are the strategies that you are currently living / practicing at your homes / circles to heal and build together?
Well, I participate in the SWAPA circles, the ceremonial circles of the Naupala witnesses, Nawala ceremonial practices. And I'm speaking out of that place today. What do you all do to survive the institutions? What are you doing to survive the institution within which we're all working?
I am part of a collective that is called the It's funny, well, not funny, but it's nice that the collective at Berkeley is also called Democratizing Knowledge, Decolonizing Knowledge, right? So our collective here is called Democratizing Knowledge. And it has, worked here for several years before I got to Syracuse. But one of the places where I find, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I wrote a few lines to my comrades in the collective about healing on the day. I think we were all sharing something about that day that is the day of loving people. What is it called? Valentine's Day, Galentine Day. And I think it was Sunday. And so let me see what, I think it's important, right? So dear all, I hope this finds you well. I mean, it has to do with what I do to heal. I so much appreciated your greetings on this lovely day. This is to the collective, you know, Elinda Cotty, Chandra Mohanty, Himika Bhattacharya, Paula Johnson, Jackie Orr. The first time I met Chela Sandoval, this is what I said to them. Differential consciousness philosopher Nepantleta extraordinaire. She was having trouble sensing the room where she was delivering a keynote. If you were in the audience, you would have realized that even her body felt unease. She then said in her most ceremonious tone, quote, I am not sure why I'm having trouble speaking these words. Maybe you are not ready for what I have come to deliver. It may come as a surprise to you, but today I come to you and I have come to talk about love, end quote. The silence was so deep in the room that we could hear the ancestors humming their names to our ears. I continue to tell this story to many students in the classroom and beyond. When the chips are down and we very quickly want to see results without learning the anti-racist, feminist lessons in front of us, I remind them and I remind myself that we gather in the feminist, decolonial classroom to talk about love. Honoring Sandoval, I ask them and I ask ourselves, camarade, camarada, compañera, child, girl, friend, please, can you tell me what's love got to do?
Thank you, PJ. Aquí we have another question. I think this is maybe the last one since we have 3 minutes. Marta Gonzalez, gracias maestras. I identify as an artivista who utilizes music as a primary medium. Part of what my work entails is utilizing music as a process rather than a product in community, as a way to push back on the neoliberal imposition on bodies and as a way to reclaim creativity as a human right, not dictated by capitalist frameworks. As I attempt to build the language around decolonial practices within the academy, how can we escape the taming, co-optation, and domestication of the language itself, or for our methodologies not to fall into commodifications? Or is it possible to escape?
Someone is in graduate school, maybe? No, I'm sorry. No, just that's a silly question, silly.
Oh, yeah, that's, my heart breaks at hearing this question. It's one that we all have to confront when we look at our lives and see what it is we've created and want to create. And that I think just like we're talking, Mariana was talking about the word decoloniality becoming a commodity, a jargonized term. And we are working it, we keep working it, we need to keep sensuously moving ourselves through meaning. And you who work with song and music that moves through our sensorium and pushes us to feel anew, you're questioning how to not let performance become commodified, how to not let the production of art, your artivism, become commodified, how to continue being a live, living purveyor, a Nepantleta, a bridge maker between communities, a bridge maker capable of calling up the social physics of love I believe, I saw you speak the other day, you call up the social physics of love when you work. I don't know if you can always do it. I don't know if things will always be the same. You're in it now, and we may have to change and challenge the dynamics of power around us. But as Gloria would say, contigo, I go with you. This is a profound question that we ask ourselves all the time, and I haven't answered it for myself. It's a constant question, and it hurts. It hurts to try to find one's place in a system that doesn't become commodified. Thank you for your question.
May I say that I love the question too, and it is a question that is always in my mind, and I talk about it with students. And I think our thought, our ways of being will be commodified in academia. Graffiti, everything that has been done, the spoken word becomes a mere object of analysis. So in the end, what do? I think that we have to embody. We have to embody those things that we write. And I think that's the only way. They can take the work and make it yet another consumer object, but you cannot become that yourself. And it's hard to do that. But I think that we have to be committed not to become what we're supposed to become as our work becomes known. And I think that way, one can go to sleep and fall asleep. One can sleep knowing that while our ways of, our ideas are being taken up in different ways that we don't want them to be taken up, that we ourselves, our ways of being with others, have not been co-opted that way. And I think that's not just survival. For me, it's not just survival. It's a way of being in the world that makes it possible for me to appreciate art the way that I do, because art has been commodified. And I know that art can be much more than that. It can help me heal, make me, transform me and other people. And so as long as we do not commodify ourselves, I think that at least we have that.
We need to stay in touch with each other, because I work inside of an institution, a large institution, a university, where the tradition is to gauge, judge, assess the value of my work as a commodity. And of course, the way that is judged is according to the standards of every individual academic whose talents are brought to bear on the judgment of me. And so we're trying to survive inside of institutions that are not operating on decolonial premises, on valuing what it is we are bringing and offering. We need to find ways to stay connected with each other and support each other's survival. And I know that I'm not good at that. And I apologize to all of you, but I know how it's important to all of our survival, including mine.
Do you think that because we started a few minutes after 6:30, well, 6:30, well, 3:30 over there, can we go like a few more minutes, do you think? Like maybe 3 more minutes, 4 more minutes? Particularly, there's 180 people. I mean, that doesn't happen every day, right? Yeah, Gabriela, you raised your...
To add my 2 cents to the question, maybe bringing Lugones in, right? Like, because I mean, like the multiplicity of meaning here and the multiple way of seeing each other and the logics of resistance and the logic of domination and being, understanding that meaning speaks to both. It's not that I'm saying, hey, you know, being co-opted is impossible, but it's definitely a way and an amount of tools. And it's not only her, right? Like it's all the literature by women of color and third world feminism that has to do with this understanding of multiple realities and multiple meanings. So if we think that cooptation happens within the logic of domination, we have a lot of room to create within the logics of resistance and living different for another meaning. So it makes cooptation less tremendous, you know, less like agonizing, I believe.
The one thing I wanted to add about cooptation is that in a way, not unfortunately, is that it is one with the corporate university that once I landed a tenure track job, I became so much more isolated. And that even though every time that I walk into that room where I think that those are my kindred spirits, we all are very well-meaning. And yet what we cook together doesn't make us live more with a wider sense of our possibilities, right? Of being there for each other, of like, you know, what Laura Perez has written about, you are my other me, right? That type of praxis that is ongoing, consistent, that it means that you will show up, that you will check, that people are not just barely making it, but they may, you know, that they flourish. There's a tremendous difference. So with respect to cooptation, I find myself it's a dilemma, right? It's like, okay, I have lots of room to emphasize the many ways in which I'm becoming other than human. But what is truly counterintuitive is how lonelier and lonelier I get. And that is like a great contradiction. So about the resistance, I mean, one of the things that truly strikes me about methodology of the oppressed is that when Sandoval is describing the Jameson, right? Frederick Jameson's, the moment of realization, right? It's like, guy, you're getting here really late for the party. The party was here, it's gone, it's no longer here. And that moment of affect, right? That moment of affect of telling you, well, you just kind of trying to get into this vibe, into this breaking of subjectivity that, you know, the colonized had been navigating for centuries. And so that this dissonance about the affectivity of how we meet each other, it's crucial for me. And in that sense, I can see, yeah, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, I'm a pedagogue, so I have to work with whatever it's in the classroom. Yeah, I understand. Now, but I do see that there is a qualitative difference to that resistance. And my work, my praxis is to inhabit an apparition, something that is beyond the pale, looming into some type of future untapped and unknown. And otherwise, it's like we only have Frederick, Jamesons in the classroom, or in any other political work that we engage. Right? So that's I wanted to kind of add.
I want to say something very quickly. I just want to say that I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage to stay in touch with our own feelings and with our own intuition. I think that colonization and neocolonization have to do with the desprestigiar, with the minimize and the mythology, the modern day comida de coco, right? The modern day like a brainwashing, that there is no spirit, there is no intuition, there's nothing psychic, that all of things are superstitions. And I think that we are at a time and place of reality for the planet and for ourselves as beings that are part of it, that those kinds of philosophies that we as racialized, negatively racialized beings can see are so political, you know? And so I think that we really need each other, and we need to listen to each other, and we need to learn from each other, and we need to circulate what we know, and we need to support each other. And I think that we have to authorize ourselves, right? This is the great, great lesson that many people have shared all over the world, but for me certainly came through that first great generation of US women of color, right? That encouraged us to use art, to be artful, to be aware of what we're performing in the world. And so I think that for everyone who's here, I have seen the way in which these thinkers are trying to think in a way that itself is not violent. Because I think we're taught to think in ways that are violent, as if there's only one way to quote unquote think, right? Part of Mariana's work, part of Gabriela's work, part of what Chela has been theorizing, part of what PJ has been theorizing is that the words that we receive colonize us in dominant colonizing languages. There are not only other words, there are other ways of knowing, you know, and though this is difficult, this is terrain that's not well mapped, our bodies, our intuitions, take us, and our creativity take us towards spaces of our vision, our desire, our hope, our love. And I think that so many people think that writing about love and relationship and affection is so corny, and they gender it and dismiss it as being in an offensive way, so femmy. And I think it takes courage to take those kinds of narratives and critique them, but not just stay there reacting, and do our own thing. You know, we each have gifts, and we have the right to deliver them, whether they're small or large. So yo creo que ese valor es un lugar muy importante, y no olvidarnos, right? Not forget, as PJ was saying, how vital affection is for us to show up for each other, to struggle against that sometimes super, super closed. Sometimes we get so closed because we're so overwhelmed, right? And so la medicina es el cariño, right? Affection is medicine. So hay que darle gas al cariño, ¿verdad? So gracias. Nomás quería compartir. I just want to share that with all of you. And just, I want to also ahora darles gracias a todos y pasarle la palabra a mi compañera Patricia, y para empezar a cerrar el programa.
Well, we have turned this into a sobremesa, and this is just so wonderful to be able to continue to disrupt the time frames and continue to talk. Thank you, PJ, for suggesting that we stay a few minutes, because we deserve those few minutes, because we are like the space you so generously commented to Cecilia at that cafe, that we need to make our own spaces, and we need to own the spaces in which we live, in which we participate. Just thank you to the participants who joined us via Zoom and who wrote and gave us questions and listened to us. And I know we'll certainly watch and view this video in about a week or so. I think, right, Laura, will be available online. And to our panelists, our teachers, our mentors, our guides, thank you for the meditation. Thank you for the opportunity that you have given us to hold your knowledge in our hands for a few minutes, to care for it, to then, you know, appreciate it beyond the minutes, and to guide our thinking, continue to guide our thinking and our ideas. We must stay in touch. We must stay in care, and we must stay in love. Thank you so much. And if I can ask you to unmute yourselves and think about Maria Lugones and say, Maria Lugones, presente.
María Lugones,
Presente.
presente.
María Lugones, presente.
Presente.
María Lugones, presente.
Well, Laura, thank you for coordinating, for supervising, for the love. And till the next time.